I'm a geographer by training. My research and teaching interests focus on environmental issues in sub-Saharan Africa. In particular, I research agricultural biotechnology and its impact among smallholder farmers in Uganda and Kenya in East Africa. So my teaching, my courses focus mostly on broad issues of global environmental politics and especially environmental issues as they play out in sub-Saharan Africa. My interest in deep learning or experimental learning was peaked a few years ago when I started teaching at Dal. Most of my courses that focus on global environmental politics, I noticed, really ended the same way. And that is that I had a lot of my students who were sort of calling, there was sort of a consensus call for more participation, more inclusiveness, more sustainability. And that was often the way we ended the course. And for me, this kind of qualifies as shallow learning because you don't hear anyone arguing for less sustainability or less participation or less inclusiveness. The point, it seems to me, is really to get students to think critically about how these kinds of buzzwords are operationalized in practice, and indeed how they play out amid when you have a bunch of people who use these words in very different ways depending on their political position and their desired outcome. So the teaching method that I've relied on to try to push through some of these development buzzwords is the role-play simulation, which I do at the College of Sustainability. The role-play simulation is where students represent the interests of a particular stakeholder in the first person. So students immerse themselves in a role-play, a simulated negotiation of an international multilateral agreement. They represent a particular stakeholder, and they argue that position in the first person. I got interested in role-play simulations when I was in high school. I was a big fan of model UNs and model parliaments. I did them a lot. Obviously, I wasn't the coolest kid in high school, but it's come in handy later on. I've used role-play simulations in a couple different ways, but the one that I'm going to talk about today is within Dalhousie's College of Sustainability. So the College of Sustainability is housed at the pretty new building at Le Marchand in Coburg. It's a transdisciplinary initiative, so all the core courses within the College of Sustainability are co-taught by different faculty members. Each core course is a full credit course that's compressed into a single semester. There are, in our course, at least 3 lectures, 3 hours of lecture, 2 hours of tutorial, and then 1 hour, which is an evening lecture series that takes place every week. Our students come from a variety of the different participating faculties, the majority from the Faculty of Arts and Social Science, the Faculty of Science. We also have students from Faculty of Management, Computer Science. I think there are 7 participating faculties in total. So the course that I co-teach, my co-instructor is Elizabeth DeSanto, who is in the Marine Affairs program in the Faculty of Management. Elizabeth and I co-teach a course which is called SUS 2001, Environment, Sustainability, and Governance, A Global Perspective. It's one of the core courses that's offered at the second-year level, so it's mandatory for all students who are taking the sustainability program. What distinguishes our course within the curriculum offered at the college is really the 2 Gs. First, it's a global focus, so we're really focused on international environmental issues, and the second G is governance. We're focused on how different bodies have come together to manage or regulate environmental issues. Basically, it's a course on global environmental governance. So we have 3 substantive modules. We start with biodiversity conservation. We do 3 weeks on food and agriculture, 3 weeks on environmental security, and the entire course then culminates in a 3-week role-play simulation. So I put the course objectives, learning objectives up on the slide for you. The purpose of the simulation is to highlight the complex and interrelated dynamics that characterize the negotiation of multilateral environmental agreements, or MEAs. Multilateral environmental agreements are these international agreements that govern global environmental crises. So the one that most people are familiar with is the Kyoto Protocol, negotiated in 1997 to deal with this issue of climate change. So the primary learning objective of the simulation is to help students understand why consensus on multilateral environmental agreements is so difficult to achieve in real life. And the second learning objective is to allow students an opportunity to hone some of the skills that are crucial to successful international negotiation, things like lobbying, mediation, negotiation, public speaking, stuff like that. So the setting for our simulated negotiation is the CBD. The CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, is the multilateral environmental agreement that's dedicated to sustaining global biodiversity. So like most other big multilateral environmental agreements, the CBD is governed by biannual Conference of Parties. These are COPs. These biannual meetings that are these massive international meetings attended by thousands of delegates, representatives of different nation states, multilateral organizations, every UN organization is represented, all the big international NGOs, lots of indigenous groups from around the world, industry representatives and media organizations will come together every 2 years to debate the specifics of the Convention on Biological Diversity. The most recent Conference of Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity took place in Nagoya, Japan in October of 2010. And it focused on the issue of access and benefit sharing, which is ABS. Access and benefit sharing is one of the pillars of the CBD, and it refers to the fair and equitable sharing of benefits that emerge from the commercialization of genetic resources. So through such ventures as conservation or bioprospecting, the search for pharmaceutical in different parts of the global south, these kinds of commercialization ventures produce lots of money, and so there's great debate about how corporations, governments, research institutes should share those benefits with poorer nations, and especially indigenous groups that reside in those poorer nations. So you have thousands of delegates from all over the world who come to Nagoya in October 2010 to debate this issue of access and benefit sharing. Everyone was there, even Indiana Jones. And it was at this meeting that these delegates came together and they produced what's known as the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing. So this is the document, the governance agreement, that sets the rules for how genetic resources should be commercialized and how the benefits from commercialization should be shared. So this is where real life ends and where our simulation begins. So in real life, there is this protocol that sets out the rules of the game for negotiating these issues over ABS. What we do in class is we reopen debate on the 4 most contentious articles of the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing. So we chose the 4 articles that we thought would generate the most interesting debate, the specifics on the fair and equitable sharing of benefits, access, issues of traditional knowledge, and monitoring and evaluation. In terms of logistics, each student in the class, students in about the 3rd or 4th week of class are given a list of all the stakeholders that they can represent. Nation states, NGOs, industry representatives, multinational organizations. We now have media organizations as well. So students get to choose which role they represent on a first signed up, first served basis. And we actually use this on the OWL site. Erin was a huge help because we just did it this week. So students, we just make it live during class and they can plug in which stakeholder they want. The rules of procedure that govern our meetings are adapted from the actual rules of procedure that govern the real CBD meetings. So we stress a certain level of formality and decorum in order to recreate the feel of the Conference of Parties. And we do this because we really want to try to get students to immerse themselves in the experience of the role-play simulation. So we were able to provide lanyards, which are the name tags that everyone wears, and placards, which is what people raise when they want to speak, all again modeled on the real CBD. As course instructors, we assumed the roles of the Secretaries General. So we explained to the students that everything that happened in the course of the simulated negotiation is entirely at our discretion. Basically, we were God within the simulated negotiation. We told them that. We encouraged students to dress the part. As you can see, we dressed up, and we look really good. So the way we structured the simulation was according to this model of blended learning. Our goal was to thoughtfully and strategically integrate computer-mediated interactions alongside the more traditional educational approaches. So we sought to combine 3 educational delivery models: self-paced learning, where students would do preparatory work on their own, face-to-face learning, mostly lectures and tutorials, and then online learning. And the goal was that these 3 different ways of learning would be interrelated and hopefully in kind of a messy way that would help to recreate the complexity of negotiating international agreements. So that just shows you with a little more specifics the specific components attached to each of these 3 components, and I'll just go through each of them in a little more detail. So the self-paced learning. We were really concerned that students would feel overwhelmed by this process. So we wanted to make sure that we gave them a very gradual, very incremental introduction to both the substantive and the procedural aspects of the simulated negotiation. The first substantive module on biodiversity that we teach in the first 4 weeks of the course, students are introduced to the Convention on Biological Diversity. They're introduced in lecture and tutorial to the issue of access and benefit sharing. We had some skill development workshops where we focus on the ins and outs of effective policy formation and debate. What we also do in the first substantive module on biodiversity conservation is we have a mini role-play simulation that takes place over 2 weeks in tutorial. And this takes place around the issue of community-based conservation. So the substantive issue is different than what we're doing here, but procedurally, the idea that students have to immerse themselves in this role and debate these outcomes and negotiate and mediate, that is all the same. And so this was important training. Students are instructed on how to represent a role, how to effectively articulate a position, both verbally and in writing. They're given a debrief with tutorials. They're graded by their TAs. They receive some feedback and grades on how well they did. So we found that that was important preparation for the much bigger simulated negotiation that takes place later on. They have required readings for the simulated negotiation, again, both on substantive and procedural aspects. There's also a major assignment that's attached to the simulated negotiation. This is a position paper that's written in the first person, so according to the stakeholder that particular student is representing. And this position paper outlines the background, who they are, what their intended outcomes are for the simulation, how they're going to go about achieving them. And we had this position paper due on the day that the simulated negotiation begins. So the idea is, on that day when everything goes a little crazy, they have a document in front of them that guides exactly what their position is and how they should go about achieving it. In fact, the last page of the position paper is actually written in the style of UN resolutions. UN resolutions, like the CPD, are written in a particular language. We call it UNEs, right? And so we've introduced students to this particular language, and one of the skills is that they're going to try to write articles and clauses that they will propose for adoption. They have those in front of them when the simulation begins on the first day. So that's the self-paced learning. We have 2 forums that allow for face-to-face learning. The first of the lectures. So the lectures that take place during the simulated negotiation, there are 4 of them, we call the plenary sessions. These are the big formal sessions that are attended by every stakeholder. This is the time for moderated debate moderated by the Secretaries General, the teachers, us, and we're moderating debate on each of the 4 articles that are under discussion, and this is where we undertake the final vote on the particular text that students have proposed that will be adopted within our fictitious Convention on Biological Diversity. The plenary sessions were also the site for any acts of organized dissent. So these included placards and banners by environmental NGOs who were pleading for concerted action. We had seeds that were distributed by indigenous groups calling attention to the protection of farmers' rights of planting materials. So we encourage those students who are representing groups like Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth to create effective mechanisms of media blitzes and dissent in the same way they do in real life. The second forum for face-to-face learning was the working group, so these are tutorials. So each working group is moderated by a committee chair, which is the TA, and each working group is tasked with delving into one of the 4 articles under debate. We have 4 tutorials, 4 TAs in the class, so we have 4 articles that are under debate. And each working group is tasked with developing the specific language and clauses that would then be voted on in the formal plenary session in the lectures. And the more informal nature of the working groups, most tutorials had 20-25 students, allowed for more opportunities for lobbying, for mediation, for coalition building, and this kind of thing. The third forum for negotiation was online collaborative learning. So here we made use of Dal's online learning software, so the OWL site. We're now translating this over to the new OWL site, and it creates an online negotiation space that has 2 major components. The first component are the discussion boards. We have 2 major discussion boards that are attached to the simulated negotiation. One is devoted to logistical issues and concerns. So this is a discussion board that is not in role. So you can see things like can't access Wiki docs, having trouble, please someone help. So these are students communicating with us as instructors, communicating with the TAs. They're having some technical difficulties figuring things out, and we answer those and address those issues out of role. So we address those issues as instructors. The second discussion thread is in role. So this is devoted to stakeholder discussion. It allows students to state their position on a given issue, to upload videos or documents in support of their position, to form coalitions of like-minded stakeholders around a particular issue or item that's up for debate. So these discussion boards prove very popular among students. Each of the year that we've run the simulated negotiation, the first year we had around 250 posts to the enrolled discussion board. Last year we had over 300. The second online forum that we make use of was the Campus Pack Wiki. So we're all familiar with wikis, these editable websites that allow students to collectively build on the existing text of each of the 4 articles that we have under debate in the simulation. So this software allows students to post amendments, it allows students to post revisions, comments on the actual article text. What students are able to do through the wikis is modify the original article to create new versions of the articles that will then be voted on in the plenary sessions. Other students can then comment on these changes, they can indicate their support for the change, they can suggest compromise wording to move beyond impasses. So this is just the Wikidocs homepage that introduces students to the process. We have a whole instructions page as well. And then they can link to the particular text for each of the 4 articles that are under debate. So from this main text, from this main page, they link to a particular page that focuses on the wording of each of the 4 articles. So this is the wiki devoted to Article 4 on fair and equitable sharing benefits. So this is the language that emerged from that meeting in Nagoya in real life. This is the actual text from the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing. So this is what the article looks like on the first day of the simulation when students start. This is the exact same article modified by students. So all the deletions, the revisions, the additions in those different colors are done by the students themselves, proposing specific text that reflects their particular bargaining position. So each of these articles becomes this very messy conversation about how we can try to achieve a particular wording that is going to appeal to all of us, despite our different political positions. And it's these final versions of the wikis that are then voted on by the entire group in the final plenary lecture session. In addition to the comments and revisions and deletions that are made in the text itself, at the end of each one of the articles, there is a section for comments. So at the bottom of each of the wikis, students representing these various stakeholders then can say that they recommend changing a word, they agree with that, they propose a deletion, someone disagrees with it. So this is the discussion that followed one of the 4 articles. This is about 20% of the discussion. The discussion went on for pages and pages and pages over a couple weeks. It becomes very messy, very complex, just like it does in real life. So in practice, all 3 elements of the blended learning model really feed into one another. You have the self-paced learning that prepares students for the procedural and substantive challenge of negotiating multilateral environmental agreements by offering an incremental, a gradual progression of skills. Students also arrive on the first day of class with this position paper in hand, so they have their some suggestions for revisions or additions in hand that they can then propose to the wikis or talk to their coalition members about online or in person. The plenary sessions, the working groups, offer students a chance to articulate their position to other stakeholders, offers them a chance to build coalitions around these positions, defend their positions against those who hold opposing views. And finally, the virtual negotiations present students the opportunity to see the specific changes, to propose specific changes, to see the changes proposed by others. And they offer forums for mediating conflicts, proposing compromise solutions. The final versions then of the online articles are voted on again in the plenary session. So in this way, all 3 learning components reinforce one another in an effort to replicate the real-world nuance, the real-world complexity that characterizes international negotiation. So if you think back to our 2 learning objectives, the first learning objective was to help students appreciate why consensus on these issues of global environmental governance is so difficult to achieve in practice. So in the first year, we just did some qualitative feedback, asked students what they thought, and these kind of quotes. I did not realize how particular international negotiations are, especially the wording. It's extremely complicated to get consensus on anything, especially when it comes to legally binding agreements. Just underlining, students at the end felt frustrated. They felt a bit disappointed. I'll just let you know that in both years, the actual amount of text that ends up coming to an agreement and actually gets voted on by the plenary session is extremely small. And that's the point. We want to emphasize that these kinds of conversations are so hard, and the specific wording is so hard to figure out, that often these kinds of agreements don't end in consensus or calls to action. For the second learning objective that focus on the skill negotiation, we have some student feedback here making reference to skills honed during the simulation, things like public speaking, policy formation, and analysis. So in the first year, we offered some qualitative feedback to get a sense of what students were learning through this process. As we became more interested in how and whether role-play simulations enhance student learning, we've launched a larger research project that seeks to really measure how and in what way students benefit from this kind of exercise. So what we did last year was we gave them a pre-survey as a baseline measure, and then had a post-survey after the simulated negotiation was complete. And we're working on now a publication that compares which elements, obviously it's a self-assessment of student learning, but where students feel like they benefited, which skills were honed, and what insights were gleaned. We're doing the same thing this year, so we're hoping to have a fairly robust, rigorous, and longitudinal data set in which we can identify the particular benefits that these kinds of immersive role plays offer to student learning.